The year was 79 CE. Multiple vessels departed from Baiae as the sun disappeared behind Mount Vesuvius. On board sat Rome's most powerful senators, accompanied by amphora after amphora of Falernian wine. Their destination lay just visible across the darkening water, private islands with no official names on any imperial map. The cargo manifests listed wine, food, musicians. They did not list the other commodity being transported. Young slaves, carefully selected from markets across the empire, purchased specifically for what awaited them. What happened on these islands was not hidden from Rome. It was funded by the imperial treasury, operated with senatorial approval, and documented in account ledgers that archaeologists would uncover 2,000 years later beneath the ash of Pompeii. The Bay of Naples contained multiple private islands scattered across its turquoise waters. Nisida sat closest to the mainland, barely 2 miles from the resort town of Baiae. Procida lay 5 miles out, large enough to support permanent buildings and staff. Pandateria, now called Ventotene, sat furthest from shore at 25 miles. Parthenope occupied the space between Nisida and Procida, though today it rests completely submerged beneath the waves. These were not imperial properties like Capri. They belonged to wealthy senators, freedmen, entrepreneurs, and members of the imperial family who preferred their involvement remain unofficial. The ownership created a legal gray zone, technically Roman territory. They operated practically autonomous from mainland law. Baiae provided the foundation for everything that happened offshore. Seneca called it the harbor of vice. He wrote that chastity went to die on those shores. The resort town had already earned its reputation as Rome's capital of excess. Wealthy Romans built elaborate villas along the coastline. They came to drink, gamble, and escape the social constraints of the capital. The islands extended this culture of transgression beyond even Baiae's permissive boundaries. What happened in Baiae stayed in Baiae, the saying went. But islands offered something more valuable than discretion. They offered total absence of witnesses. The economic structure was purely commercial. These were not imperial retreats, but private enterprises operating for profit. Entry required membership in what functioned as an exclusive club. The fees were staggering. A single visit cost 10,000 sesterces minimum. For context, a skilled craftsman earned 800 sesterces per year. Revenue flowed from multiple sources. Entrance fees formed the base income. Slave rentals generated additional profits. Entertainment bookings, food, wine, all carried significant markups. The operations ran seasonally. May through September brought peak traffic when calm seas and warm weather made crossing comfortable. Specific families controlled specific islands. The Lucullus estate owned Nisida through inheritance from Lucius Licinius Lucullus, the famous general and epicure. A consortium of freedmen operated Procida. These were former slaves who had gained wealth through trade and investment. Pandateria served dual purposes. One side housed political exiles sent by various emperors. The other side hosted the most explicit operations, its distance from the mainland providing extra security. Imperial family members held silent partnerships in several operations. They collected profits without public association. The arrangement allowed them to benefit financially, while maintaining plausible deniability. The islands themselves provided natural security. Water created barriers that walls never could. No random travelers appeared unexpectedly. No merchants wandered through. Every arrival was visible from shore. Every departure tracked and recorded. Maritime law of the period contained ambiguities that made prosecution difficult for activities occurring offshore, and bodies could disappear into deep water far more easily than into Italian soil. The geography was not accidental. It was essential to everything that followed. Roman senators filled the boats during their scheduled recesses. The equestrian class, Rome's business elite, made up another significant portion of visitors. Wealthy provincials seeking advancement in Roman society saw the islands as networking opportunities. Foreign dignitaries received invitations as part of diplomatic entertainment. The age range skewed older, primarily men between 30 and 60. Economics alone prevented lower classes from participating. A single visit cost what a laborer earned in a decade. The invitation system operated entirely through private networks. No public advertisements existed. Current members vouched for potential newcomers through personal recommendation. Written invitations arrived on wax tablets. Fragments recovered from ancient shipwrecks show the careful language used. They mentioned symposiums, philosophical retreats, literary gatherings. Never did they specify the actual activities planned. Discretion protocols governed every stage. Invitations contained no explicit content, Recipients understood through coded phrases developed over years. A philosophical retreat meant something specific to those familiar with the system. Transportation followed deliberate patterns designed to avoid attention. Private boats departed from Baiae docks after sunset. Guests traveled from their villas to the harbor in covered litters. Witnesses saw wealthy men leaving, but not where they went. Return trips occurred before dawn. Public respectability remained intact. Imperial postal boats were sometimes diverted to transport high-ranking officials. This constituted direct misuse of state resources for private purposes. The Silence Compact bound everyone together. Each visitor became implicated through attendance. Mutual knowledge created mutual vulnerability. Prosecution would require exposing oneself. Blackmail potential kept participants loyal to the system. No surviving trial record mentions testimony against island operations. The silence held for decades. Financial barriers exceeded legal ones in effectiveness. A single visit equaled a year's salary for skilled labor. Regular visitors spent 50,000 sesterces or more per season. Only the ultra-wealthy could participate. The economic exclusivity created a club smaller and more secretive than any legal restriction could achieve. The islands served social functions beyond their primary purpose. Business deals were negotiated during visits. Political alliances formed between men who shared compromising experiences. Patronage networks established themselves through these connections. Shared transgression became a bonding mechanism more powerful than family ties. What happened on the islands created loyalty that traditional Roman values could not match. The system was self-reinforcing. Participation guaranteed continued participation. Silence guaranteed mutual protection. And money guaranteed the system would continue operating. The slave supply originated primarily from Delos, the largest market in the Mediterranean. At peak operation, 10,000 slaves sold there daily. Secondary markets in Ephesus, Alexandria, and Antioch supplemented the flow. Specialized dealers understood island requirements. They were not purchasing randomly. Every acquisition followed specific criteria. Financial records preserved in Pompeii's ash document the selection standards. Age range ran from 12 to 18 for both male and female slaves. Physical appearance mattered enormously. Roman aristocratic culture maintained specific beauty standards. Origin influenced value significantly. Greek slaves commanded premium prices. Syrian, Egyptian, and Gallic slaves filled different preferences. Each region was marketed for particular characteristics. Skills increased value dramatically. Musicians, dancers, and acrobats sold for substantially more than agricultural workers. The price differential was stark. An attractive youth cost 3,000 to 8,000 sesterces. An agricultural slave sold for 5 to 800. The market recognized and priced what buyers wanted. A grading system categorized slaves upon arrival. First-class designation went to the most attractive and skilled. Second class went to those suitable for performance and service roles. Third class handled manual labor, cleaning, and food preparation. The category determined treatment, resale value, and survival probability. Training occurred in mainland facilities around Baiae. Purpose-built schools prepared slaves for island deployment. The curriculum required 2 to 3 months completion. Slaves learned Roman etiquette and Greek poetry recitation. Dance and music instruction was mandatory. Language fluency in both Latin and Greek was expected. Appearance received meticulous attention. Obedience was conditioned through systematic punishment and reward. The numbers involved were substantial. Financial records from Pompeii banking houses mention island contracts for 50 to 100 slaves per season. Multiple islands operating simultaneously meant 200 to 400 slaves in the system at any time. Turnover ran high. Slaves were retired after 3 to 5 years when they aged beyond desirability. Replacement purchases occurred annually. Account books tracked these transactions in precise detail. Roman law provided the framework that made everything possible. Enslaved people possessed zero legal protection for bodily autonomy. Legal definitions classified slaves as property. The specific term was instrumentum vocale, meaning speaking tools. Owner rights were absolute. Consent was legally irrelevant because slaves could not give or withhold it. Injuries to slaves qualified only as property damage. Prosecution required the owner to file complaint. Island operators owned their slaves outright. No outside complaints were possible. A rotation system moved slaves between islands based on demand. High-demand individuals were rented to other operators. Rental agreements survive in papyri collections. Standard rate was 500 sesterces per week per slave. This created a secondary market among island owners. The most profitable slaves generated 10,000 sesterces annually just in rental fees. Conquest supplied another steady stream. When legions subdued provinces, slave-taking always followed. Officers selected captives based on age and appearance. Certain children were set aside for specialized markets rather than bulk sale. These selections followed patterns. Officers knew which types brought premium prices and where to sell them. Transport from eastern markets took weeks. Ships moved slaves along established trade routes. The classis missinensis, Rome's naval fleet based at nearby Misenum, occasionally provided vessels for imperial purposes. Children traveled aboard well-appointed ships. Manifest documents listed them as household attendants. The terminology obscured their actual destination and fate. Multiple historical sources document what occurred on the islands. Seneca the Elder wrote about the operations during his lifetime. Martial referenced them in his epigrams. Juvenal condemned them in his satires. Financial records from Pompeii and Herculaneum provide unemotional data. Later Christian writers preserved specific details while condemning pagan practices. The sources have biases, but they converge on essential facts. The activities were framed as Greek symposium tradition. In Greek culture, symposia meant drinking parties combined with intellectual discussion. Roman aristocrats romanticized Greek practices and used this framework as legitimizing cover. Island operators marketed their services as authentic Greek cultural experiences. The framing allowed participants to claim they pursued cultural education rather than vice. Banquets followed predictable structures that multiple sources confirm. Guests arrived at dusk. Feasts began immediately upon landing. Wine consumption was central to everything. Falernian wine, an expensive vintage, flowed without restriction. Enslaved servers wore progressively less clothing as meal courses continued. Entertainment filled the spaces between food service. Musicians performed. Dancers moved between tables. Acrobats demonstrated their skills. As night progressed, performances became increasingly explicit. Private rooms were available after communal dining ended. Entertainment fell into distinct categories. Performance acts dominated the early evening. Dancers portrayed mythological scenes carefully selected for content. Leda and the Swan showed Zeus taking a mortal lover. Ganymede and Zeus depicted divine desire for a young man. These myths featured gods conquering mortals. They provided symbolic permission structure for what guests desired. Acrobatic displays were choreographed to showcase bodies rather than pure skill. Musicians played while wearing minimal clothing. Living sculptures had slaves pose as famous Greek statues, which classical tradition depicted unclothed. Interactive entertainment began later in the evening. Bathing assistants meant slaves attended to guests in elaborate facilities. Symposium games involved drinking contests, where slave participation served as prizes for winners. Nocturnal philosophy was a euphemism appearing in multiple sources. Martial explicitly mentions games that young bodies played for old men's pleasure. The language was coded, but the meaning was clear. The physical layouts enabled different activities simultaneously. Each island contained 3 to 5 separate buildings. A central feast hall hosted communal gatherings. Private cubicula, small bedrooms, radiated from the center like spokes. Bathhouse complexes featured heated pools fed by underground furnaces. Gardens included secluded grottos and fountains positioned for privacy. The architecture deliberately separated activities. It created plausible deniability. What happened in private spaces could be denied because no witnesses existed. Different islands developed specializations over time. Nisida focused on theatrical performances. Elaborate costumes and staging equipment were permanently housed there. Procida emphasized athletic competitions. Wrestling matches followed Greek tradition of competing unclothed.